Welcome to Haunted Voice Channel. Before we get started, just a quick reminder, there are minimal ads in this video. If you enjoy the content, please hit the like button and subscribe. It really helps me create more stories for you. Also, I'd love to know where you're from and what time you're watching. I hope you enjoy the stories, and thank you so much for tuning in. Now, let's get started. The forest always had a way of swallowing sound, but tonight it felt like it was swallowing everything. I was deep in the Ouachita National Forest, far enough away from civilization that even the faintest remnants of city noise didn't reach. I liked it that way, quiet, isolated. This was my escape, a weekend camping trip to clear my mind. I'd done it dozens of times before, but something about this trip felt different. I couldn't put my finger on it at first, but the moment I set up camp, I felt off, like I didn't belong here. The air was too still, and the usual chorus of insects and birds was absent. The quiet was almost expectant. I had arrived late, later than I'd wanted, thanks to a wrong turn and a few miles of rocky, overgrown trails that nearly swallowed my Jeep. By the time I got my tent pitched and a fire going, the sun had slipped below the horizon, leaving the forest cloaked in darkness. The flames crackled, sending sparks into the air, but the warmth didn't bring me the usual comfort. I sat close to the fire, listening for any sounds, but there was nothing. Just an overwhelming, suffocating silence. Even the wind seemed to avoid this part of the woods. It was then I first heard the voice. "Help!" It was faint, almost lost in the flicker of the flames, but unmistakable. I stood up, heart thudding in my chest, straining to hear. "Help me." It came again, a soft, distant cry, a woman's voice, fragile and weak, echoing from somewhere in the trees. My flashlight swept over the dense forest, illuminating nothing but an endless sea of branches and shadows. I knew better than to go wandering into the woods at night, especially in unfamiliar terrain, but something about that voice gnawed at me. It sounded desperate, broken. I grabbed my flashlight and started walking toward the sound. The deeper I went into the forest, the thicker the air became. The trees, once tall and majestic, now felt like towering walls closing in on me. My footsteps were muffled by the thick carpet of pine needles, and the farther I ventured, the more oppressive the silence became. "Help, please." The voice grew closer, but something about it was off. It didn't fluctuate, didn't change direction, as if it were coming from everywhere and nowhere all at once. I slowed my pace, anxiety creeping up my spine. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice breaking the stillness. Nothing, just that heavy, suffocating quiet, and then I saw it, a figure standing just beyond the reach of my flashlight. A woman, dressed in pale, tattered clothing, her back to me. She was thin, almost unnaturally so, her limbs long and frail. "Hey, are you okay?" I called out, taking a cautious step closer. She didn't respond, didn't even flinch. Just stood there, motionless, as if she hadn't heard me at all. I raised the flashlight higher, and that's when I saw her face, or what was left of it. Her head jerked toward me with a sickening snap, her eyes hollow and sunken, her skin stretched tight over bone, peeling in places, and her mouth, it was wide, too wide, like someone had torn her jaw open at the corners. She stared at me, her lips trembling as though trying to speak, but the only sound that escaped was that same soft cry. "Help me." I staggered back, bile rising in my throat. My flashlight flickered, casting erratic beams across her figure, and then she was gone, vanished into the trees, as if she'd never been there at all. I stood there, frozen, my mind racing. I had to go back to camp. I had to leave. But when I turned around, the path was gone. The trees were different now, closer, gnarled, twisted in unnatural ways. There was no trail, no sign of where I'd come from. Panic set in as I realized I had no idea where I was. The forest had shifted, rearranged itself around me, and then the whispers started. Soft, unintelligible at first, like the wind moving through the trees, But it wasn't the wind. The whispers were all around me, just beyond the reach of the light, voices overlapping in a chorus of unintelligible murmurs. I spun in a slow circle, the flashlight beam barely piercing the suffocating darkness. Shadows moved at the edges of my vision, figures slipping between the trees. Too many to count, too fast to focus on. Please help me. That voice again, but now it wasn't just one. It was many. The same pleading cry, over and over, coming from all directions. I started running. I didn't know where I was going. I just knew I had to get away. The flashlight swung wildly in my hand, its beam cutting through the thick blackness. But no matter how fast I ran, the whispers followed. Louder now, more insistent. The ground beneath my feet became uneven. Roots and rocks tripping me up as I stumbled deeper into the forest. My lungs burned, my legs ached, but I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. That's when I saw it, a cabin sitting in the middle of a small clearing, its windows dark and empty, like lifeless eyes staring out at me. It wasn't on any map I'd studied, and I knew it shouldn't be here. But I had no other choice. I ran toward it, the whispers growing louder, closer. I burst through the door, slamming it shut behind me. The cabin was cold, the air inside stale, as though it had been abandoned for years. My flashlight flickered again, but I didn't care. I collapsed against the door, breathing hard, listening, silence. For the first time since I'd left camp, the forest was silent. I stood up, shining the flashlight around the small room. It was empty. No furniture, no signs of life. Just a single door at the far end of the room, slightly ajar, leading to what I assumed was a back room. I don't know why I opened it. I should have left, should have run. But something drew me to it, like a moth to a flame. The door creaked open, revealing a narrow staircase descending into darkness. My stomach dropped, every instinct screaming at me to turn around and leave, but my feet moved forward anyway, carrying me down the steps. The basement was colder than the rest of the cabin, the air thick and damp. My flashlight beam swept over the stone walls, revealing nothing but shadows. And then I saw it. A figure hunched in the corner facing the wall. It was human, or at least it had been at one point, but its skin was mottled, gray and decayed, patches of hair clinging to its scalp in uneven tufts. It rocked back and forth, muttering something under its breath. Please, help me. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. Slowly, the figure turned its head, and I realized with a sickening jolt that it wasn't just one person. It was many. Dozens of faces twisted and fused together, mouths open in silent screams, eyes wide and unseeing. The whispers erupted, louder than ever, filling the room with a cacophony of voices, all saying the same thing. Help me. I backed up, my legs trembling, but before I could reach the stairs, the door slammed shut with a deafening bang, and the thing in the corner began to rise. I don't remember how I got out. The next thing I knew, I was stumbling through the forest, the whispers fading behind me as I ran. Somehow, I found my way back to camp, though I don't know how. The trees had shifted again, the path reappearing as if the forest itself had let me go. I packed up my gear in a frenzy, not caring about the time or the darkness. I just needed to leave, to get out of those woods and never come back. As I drove away, the whispers still echoed in my ears, and when I looked in the rearview mirror, I swore I saw the woman again, standing at the edge of the trees, her hollow eyes watching me leave. I haven't been back since, but sometimes late at night I still hear them. Help me. And I know deep down that the forest isn't done with me yet. I'm not usually one for sharing spooky stories, but every time I close my eyes, I see those woods again. I hear the screams echoing through the night, the snapping of branches, the guttural sounds that I can't ever unhear, and I wonder if telling this story might finally let me sleep in peace. Last summer, my friends and I decided to take a camping trip deep into the mountains. It was me, Ryan, and Ella. We wanted to get away from everything, detox from social media, and just connect with nature. We picked an isolated spot at the edge of a large national park, far from the usual campgrounds, where we could have the place all to ourselves. We set up camp near a beautiful expansive clearing in the woods, with a small river flowing nearby. It was perfect. No cell service, no city noise, just the sounds of the wilderness. That first day was uneventful, almost peaceful. We cooked over the fire, shared a few beers, and laughed about everything and nothing until the sun dipped below the tree line. As night fell, the forest around us seemed to change. The once friendly chirping of crickets became a loud, all-encompassing buzz. The wind rustling through the trees turned into ghostly whispers, and every once in a while I thought I saw movement out of the corner of my eye, just beyond our campfire's flickering light. By the time we were ready to sleep, the forest felt like a different world, a darker, hungrier one. I shrugged it off, thinking it was just the typical anxiety of being in the middle of nowhere. I wasn't scared. Not yet. The next morning, a park ranger came through our campsite. A middle-aged man, face lined and eyes deep with some kind of weariness. His uniform was faded, and the way he moved seemed tense, as if every step through the woods was a calculated risk. He gave us a once-over, his eyes darting from our tent to our food stash. "You folks picked a hell of a place to camp," he said, scratching his grizzled beard. Ryan laughed it off. "Yeah, we wanted to get away from it all, you know?" The ranger didn't smile. "Yeah, I get that, but I'd move if I were you." "Move?" Ella asked, suddenly nervous. "Why? Is there a problem?" "Just some weird stuff goes on in this area." He hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "Strange sounds, weird sightings, nothing concrete, but, well, I've been working this park a long time. Some places are better left alone." Ryan waved him off. "We'll be fine, man. We've got bear spray and everything. We'll keep our food hung up and out of reach." The ranger just stared at us for a long time before finally nodding. "Suit yourselves. But if anything happens, head east, toward the ranger station, and stay together. Don't go wandering off alone." With that, he left, disappearing into the trees as quickly as he had come. We all exchanged nervous laughs once he was gone. Ryan cracked a joke about horror movies, and we brushed it off. But I couldn't shake that gnawing feeling that something was off, that maybe we should have taken his advice. That night it started. Around 2 a.m., I woke up to the sound of something heavy moving around outside the tent. At first I thought it was just an animal, a deer, maybe a bear. But then I heard a noise that didn't belong in the forest, a low, raspy voice calling my name. "Jason," it rasped. "Jason." I shot up, my heart pounding. Ella stirred beside me, half asleep, and I whispered to her, "Did you hear that?" "Hear what?" she mumbled. Someone called my name." She shook her head, already drifting back to sleep. "You're just dreaming. Go back to bed." But I couldn't. I sat there listening to the night until eventually exhaustion overtook me, and I passed out. The next morning, Ryan said he heard something too, a voice but calling his name. We all laughed it off, blaming it on the wind or some weird echo in the trees. But deep down, I could see that unease in their eyes, the same fear I felt in the pit of my stomach. That day, we decided to hike deeper into the woods, hoping to distract ourselves. The forest was thick, the trees packed so closely together that even at noon, sunlight barely pierced the canopy. And that feeling of being watched? It only grew stronger the deeper we went. After a couple of hours, we found a small clearing, and that's when we saw it, a deer. But something was wrong with it. Its body was twisted, contorted like it had been hit by a car, but still managed to walk. And its eyes. God, those eyes. They were milky white, and as we stood there, it slowly turned its head to look at us. No, not look at us. Through us. Ella backed away, muttering, "What the hell?" The deer let out this guttural, human-like groan before bolting into the woods, moving far faster than it should have been able to with those broken legs. We stood in stunned silence for a moment before Ryan laughed, too loud, too forced. "That's just nature, I guess," he said. "Messed up animals, right?" We all pretended to believe that. That night we sat around the campfire in silence. There was no joking, no storytelling. We were all too tense, and then just as the last embers of our fire began to die down, we heard it. A scream. Not a normal scream, but one that sounded like it came from a human, and an animal, and something else entirely. It came from deep within the woods, echoing and twisting around us. Was that a person? Ella whispered, her voice shaking. Ryan shook his head. No way, it's probably just an animal. Yeah, I said, but I didn't believe it. None of us did. The screaming continued, closer this time, and then we heard something that froze my blood. A voice. My voice. Help. Help me. It whimpered, but it was distorted like a recording being played back through broken speakers. Ja'asan, help me. I shot up, my breath catching in my throat. And then, as if in response, another voice, Ryan's, echoed back from the woods, mimicking him perfectly. Ella, run, it called, perfectly imitating Ryan's tone, his cadence. Run, Ella, run. Without thinking, we grabbed whatever we could carry and ran. The voices followed us, mocking us, calling our names in our own voices. The forest seemed to close in, branches clawing at us like hands. We didn't stop until we stumbled out into the clearing by the ranger station, panting and shaking. The ranger was there, standing on the porch. He looked at us with that same weary expression, like he had seen this before. You met it, he said flatly, as if confirming a suspicion. What the hell is it? Ryan demanded, still catching his breath. The ranger shook his head. Some call it a skinwalker. Some say it's a spirit. Others say it's a curse. It's something old. Something this land was never meant to wake up. You folks, you didn't listen. We stared at him, dumbfounded, trembling in the cold night air. But you're safe now, he said, though his voice held no comfort. As long as you leave. Right now. We packed up, never looking back, driving for hours until we finally found a hotel, leaving the woods behind us. And while we drove, we heard it, just barely, over the hum of the engine. Those voices, fading into the night. Our voices calling after us. Now, every so often, in the dead of night, I wake up to hear my name being whispered in that same raspy, haunting voice, always coming from just outside my window, and I wonder if we truly escaped, or if it's just waiting for me to come back to the woods. I used to hike and camp all the time, my way to unwind after a long week stuck behind a desk. Alone in the wilderness, away from the noise of the world, it felt like freedom. At least, it used to. But after what happened last fall, I'll never set foot in a forest again. It was October, the perfect season to be outside. That brisk, clean air, the trees all flaming red and gold. It's like the woods themselves are alive. So, I took a long weekend off and decided to go somewhere new, a place called Blackthorn Forest, way up north off the beaten trail. I had heard about it from an old hiking forum where some guy mentioned it was untouched, perfect for real campers. The drive up was long and winding. There weren't even proper signs leading to Blackthorn, just an old road that seemed to go on forever, narrowing and twisting through dense trees. And finally, I reached a rusty metal gate with a hand-painted sign that read, Blackthorn Forest, enter at your own risk. I assumed it was just a leftover joke from whoever managed the place. I mean, what could possibly happen? I parked the car, hoisted my pack onto my shoulders, and set off down the main trail. But after about half a mile, I found something strange. A tattered map nailed to a tree. The ink was smudged and faded, but it showed a trail leading deeper into the woods that wasn't on any official map. Perfect, I thought. A hidden path. I figured this must be what the forum was talking about, so I decided to follow it. I didn't see a single soul for hours. The only sounds were my own footsteps and the occasional rustling leaves as deer bolted off into the underbrush. After hiking all day, I set up camp by a small stream and lit a fire as the sun dipped below the trees. Darkness fell quickly, and with it came that eerie quiet you only get deep in the woods. But I didn't mind. I loved it. I had just settled into my tent, the warmth of the fire still flickering outside, when I heard footsteps, soft but unmistakable, like someone was walking along the trail. I peeked out, expecting to see another hiker, but instead I saw a man standing by the edge of the trees, just outside the ring of firelight. He wore an old, worn-out park ranger's uniform, and his face was deeply lined, like he'd been out there for decades. He had this odd, unsettling smile on his face, and it didn't quite reach his eyes. "Evening," he said, tipping his hat. Hey," I replied, a bit startled. I hadn't seen any rangers marked on the trail map, and I couldn't remember passing a ranger station. "You camping alone?" he asked, his eyes locked on mine, that smile never wavering. "Yeah, just for the weekend. I didn't think there'd be any rangers out this far." "Oh, we're out here," he said, voice low and gravelly. "Out here to keep folks safe, you know." "Safe from what?" I asked, trying to laugh it off. The ranger's smile faded, just a flicker of something in his eyes, worry maybe, or fear. "Just things that come out at night. Best to stay on the main trail, stick to the light." He gestured to my fire, his eyes drifting to the dark woods behind me. "Okay, thanks for the heads up," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. He nodded, tipped his hat again, and then he was gone, disappearing into the darkness. I stayed up for hours, the fire burning bright, every snap of a branch or whisper of wind sending my nerves on edge. Finally, exhaustion took over, and I drifted off, dreaming uneasy dreams of shadowy figures stalking the woods around me. I woke up to silence, the kind of heavy, oppressive silence that makes your ears ring. And as I opened my eyes, I noticed two things. My fire was completely out, just cold ashes now, and my tent flap was open. That's when I saw them, footprints. They circled my campsite, leading from the trail into the woods, and then back out again, like someone, or something, had been watching me while I slept. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe the ranger had come back, maybe it was an animal. But the prints were too big, and they had a weird shape, almost like a person's foot, but wrong. Like the toes were too long, and there were claw marks at the ends. I packed up quickly, heart pounding, and decided to head back to my car. The sooner I got out of there, the better. I tried to follow the trail I'd come in on, but no matter how far I walked, it didn't look familiar. I checked my map, but that only made things worse. None of the landmarks lined up. It was like the forest itself had changed overnight. I must have walked in circles for hours until the sun started to set again. I was panicking, trying to find any clue to get me back to the road. And then I saw him, the ranger, standing ahead on the trail, still wearing that worn uniform, still with that unsettling smile. "Thank God," I said, rushing up to him. "I've been lost all day. I need to get back to my car." The ranger didn't answer right away. He just stared at me, that same smile frozen on his face. "You've wandered too deep," he finally said, his voice softer now, like he was telling me a secret. "They don't let you leave once you've seen them." "What? Who doesn't let you leave?" I asked, feeling a growing dread. "The Watchers," he whispered, leaning in close. "They watch, they wait, they feed." Before I could ask him what he meant, he stepped off the trail and vanished into the trees like a ghost. I ran after him, but when I got to where he'd stood, there was nothing. No footprints, no broken branches, just endless woods. I turned back to the trail, but it was gone too, swallowed up by the forest. And then I heard it, a low growling hum like something huge was breathing just inches from my ear. The trees around me started to sway, and I swear I saw shapes moving between them. Tall, thin figures, their eyes glowing like embers in the growing darkness. They watched me, just as the ranger had warned. I ran. I ran like hell, tearing through the underbrush, branches clawing at my face, the trees seeming to close in on me. The growling grew louder, and I could hear laughter, soft, mocking laughter from all around. I didn't know where I was going. I just knew I had to get away, to escape whatever was hunting me. Somehow, by some miracle, I stumbled onto a dirt path that led to the road. I found my car, threw my pack into the back, and drove without stopping, not even to catch my breath, until I was miles away from Blackthorn Forest. I thought it was over. I thought I was safe. But a few nights later, I woke up to a tapping on my bedroom window. I froze, my heart in my throat, and slowly turned to look. There, on the other side of the glass, was a face, lined and leathery, with a familiar, unsettling smile. The ranger. His eyes locked onto mine, and his lips moved silently. I couldn't hear what he was saying, but I knew what it was. "You've wandered too deep. They don't let you leave." I shut my blinds, curled into a ball, and waited for the tapping to stop. Eventually it did, but every night since I've heard it. Light, rhythmic tapping, sometimes at my window, sometimes on the door. Always just after midnight, and every time I know he's out there watching me, waiting for the day I slip back into the woods. Because once you've been to Blackthorn Forest, it never lets you go, and neither do they. So if you ever find yourself up north looking for a hike, take my advice. Stay far, far away from Blackthorn Forest. And if a ranger ever warns you to stay on the main trail, listen to him. You don't want to meet the things that come out at night. It was supposed to be a simple weekend getaway. Just me and my brother Alex camping in the woods near Crystal Falls. We'd gone there a few times as kids with our dad, and I thought it'd be a nice way to relive old memories, get some fresh air, maybe drink a few beers by the fire. We weren't looking for anything special, just a chance to unwind and escape the noise of the city. We arrived late in the afternoon, and after a short hike, found the perfect spot near the falls. The sound of the water crashing down into the rocky basin below was soothing, even with the faint mist hanging in the air. The woods around us were dense but not too thick, and the sun filtering through the autumn leaves gave the place an almost magical feel. It felt isolated, but not in a bad way, just peaceful. By dusk, we had our tent set up and a fire crackling. Alex cracked open a couple of beers, and we sat by the fire talking about work, life, and all the stuff we'd normally ignore during our busy weeks. As the sky darkened, the sound of the falls became more prominent, filling the gaps in our conversation. For the first time in months, I felt relaxed. It wasn't until the fire burned low and the night grew colder that things started to change. The air around us felt thick, almost like a pressure building. At first, I thought it was just the quiet getting to me. We were far enough out that there was no phone service, no distractions, but something about the silence felt off. It was too quiet. No animals, no rustling leaves, not even the wind moving through the trees. Just the steady rush of the falls. Alex noticed it too. "You hear that?" he asked, glancing over his shoulder toward the dark woods behind us. "Hear what?" "Exactly," he said, his voice uneasy. "There's nothing out there. No crickets, no birds, not even frogs near the water." I tried to shrug it off. Maybe it's just too cold tonight. Alex didn't look convinced, but he didn't push it. Still, I saw him glance over his shoulder every few minutes, like he was waiting for something to emerge from the trees. By the time we decided to turn in, the air had gotten colder and the fire was barely glowing. I crawled into my tent, zipped up my sleeping bag, and tried to shake the strange feeling that had settled over the camp. But as I lay there listening to the water and trying to relax, I heard something. Faint at first, but unmistakable. Footsteps. Not the crunch of leaves underfoot, not animals rustling through the brush, but distinct, deliberate footsteps. Slow and heavy. I held my breath, straining to listen. The steps were coming from the direction of the falls, moving closer to the camp, one slow step at a time. I thought it was Alex, maybe going to the edge of the water for some reason, but something about the pace of the steps unnerved me. They were too measured, too careful. "Alex?" I called out quietly, but there was no answer. I waited, heart pounding, but the footsteps continued. coming closer and closer. I unzipped my tent just enough to peek out, and that's when I saw it, standing at the edge of the trees just beyond the reach of the dying firelight. It was a man, or at least it looked like a man. But something was wrong. His figure was too tall, too thin, almost stretched, like someone had pulled his limbs longer than they should be. His skin was pale, almost gray, and his face, God, his face, was all wrong. Blank. Featureless. I blinked, my mind racing to make sense of what I was seeing, but it didn't move. It just stood there, at the edge of the woods, its head tilted slightly, like it was listening for something. I scrambled out of my tent, trying to keep quiet, and rushed over to Alex's. I shook him awake, whispering frantically, "There's someone out there." "What? Who?" Alex mumbled, still half asleep. "I don't know," I hissed. It's not right. You need to see this." I dragged him to the edge of the fire, pointing toward the trees. But when we looked, there was nothing there. The figure, or whatever it was, had vanished into the darkness. "You sure you weren't dreaming, man?" Alex asked, rubbing his eyes.
Say,
"I'm telling you, I saw it. There was someone out there. It didn't look normal." Alex scanned the tree line, squinting into the dark, but there was no sign of movement, no sound but the falls. After a few moments, he shook his head. "Look, it's probably just your mind playing tricks on you. We're out in the middle of nowhere. Let's just get some sleep, all right?" I wanted to argue, but what could I say? It had been there. I knew it. But now it was gone, and I couldn't explain it. So, reluctantly, I went back to my tent, though sleep was the last thing on my mind. I lay there wide awake, listening for any sign of the footsteps again. Hours passed, the night growing colder, the fire dying completely. And then, just as I was starting to drift off, I heard it again. The footsteps, closer this time. And they weren't slow anymore. They were quick, frantic, almost like someone was running, but not toward the camp. "Away from it!" I bolted upright and threw open the tent flap. "Alex!" I called out, but there was no response from his tent. I rushed over and unzipped it, only to find it empty. Panic set in. I grabbed my flashlight and ran toward the falls where the footsteps had seemed to be heading. The mist was thick, hanging over the rocks like a ghostly curtain. My breath came in ragged gasps as I swept the beam of light across the area. And that's when I saw him. Alex was standing at the edge of the water, staring into the falls, completely still. I called his name, but he didn't respond. He didn't even flinch. I ran up to him, shaking his shoulder. "Alex, what the hell are you doing?" He didn't move, didn't blink. His eyes were wide, glassy, locked on the rushing water like he was in some kind of trance. I shook him harder, trying to snap him out of it, but his skin was ice cold and his body stiff. And then, slowly, his lips parted, and he whispered something I could barely hear over the roar of the falls. "They're here." I froze. "What? Who's here?" But before I could get an answer, something moved in the mist. At first, it was just a shadow drifting through the fog, but then it emerged, and my heart nearly stopped. It was the same figure I had seen before, the tall, thin, featureless thing. But this time, there were more. Dozens of them, all stepping out of the mist, all moving silently toward us, their heads tilted, listening. Alex's body jerked violently, like a puppet on strings, and then he turned to face me, his eyes still wide, still unblinking. "They want us to follow." I stumbled back, shaking my head in disbelief. "No, no way. We have to go, now." But Alex didn't move. He just stared at me with that vacant expression, and the figures in the mist came closer, surrounding us, their pale bodies blending into the fog like they were a part of it. I didn't wait to find out what they wanted. I ran. I don't know how I found my way back to the car, but I did. I drove all night, leaving everything behind, not stopping until I reached the nearest town. I called the rangers, the police, anyone who would listen, but they never found Alex, never found our camp. It was as if we had never been there. But I know the truth. Something in those falls takes people, and it doesn't give them back. The forest was darker than I expected. Not just the kind of dark where your eyes adjust and things start to make sense. This was a suffocating, pressing blackness that made you doubt if you'd ever seen light at all. I was a couple of miles deep into the pine forest, far from the trailhead, and already the weight of isolation was heavy. My campsite was modest, just a small tent, a crackling fire, and the distant echoes of the world I'd left behind. No phone signal, no road noise, just the endless whisper of the trees. I'd come here seeking solitude, something to break the monotony of my day-to-day life. The rangers at the entrance had mentioned the trails were lightly trafficked, which was exactly what I wanted. But even then, there had been a look in their eyes when I said I planned to stay overnight, a look that lingered on the edge of warning. "Be sure you're back before dark," one of them had said, his voice steady but oddly cautious. I had brushed it off as standard park ranger advice, a way to keep rookies from getting lost in the maze of trees. Now, though, their caution seemed to echo in the darkness around me. As the fire settled into a rhythm of popping embers and soft glows, I noticed the silence. It was a silence that wasn't quite empty but rather felt, filled with something just beyond hearing. The kind that made the hairs on the back of your neck stand on end. Now and then, a gust of wind would shake the branches, but there were no animal sounds. Not a single rustle, no distant owl calls, nothing. It was as if the entire forest was holding its breath, listening. Around midnight, I decided to turn in. My tent was a flimsy barrier, but it was all I had, so I crawled in, zipped up, and lay there in my sleeping bag, trying to ignore the way the darkness seemed to press in from all sides. Just as I started to drift off, I heard it, a faint, high-pitched whistle. It wasn't close, but it carried through the trees with an unsettling clarity. I held my breath, listening. Then came another whistle, this time closer, as if whoever or whatever was making it was moving toward me. At first, I told myself it had to be the wind or maybe another camper playing some late-night prank. But the whistles were too deliberate, spaced just far enough apart to suggest intent. They were coming from different directions now, circling my campsite in a way that felt more like stalking than coincidence. I strained my ears, hoping to catch some sign of what it was. A voice, a footstep, anything. But the silence was impenetrable, broken only by that eerie whistle, moving around me like a predator. I don't know how long I lay there, every muscle in my body tense and ready to bolt. The whistling would stop for long stretches, and I'd start to relax, only for it to pick up again, closer each time. Eventually, I couldn't take it anymore. I unzipped my tent as quietly as I could, slipped out, and crouched low by the embers of my dying fire. The forest was a wall of blackness around me, and in that moment I felt as small as a mouse under the gaze of a hawk. That's when I saw it. At the edge of the firelight, something moved. It was barely a shadow, just a blur of motion against the trees. I squinted, trying to make it out. A deer, maybe? But as I watched, it shifted, and a sliver of moonlight caught its face, or rather what should have been a face. It was as if someone had pulled a rough mask of animal hide over a human head, eye holes hollow and empty. The figure was tall, taller than any human I'd ever seen, its limbs impossibly long and bending at strange angles, like a marionette with broken strings. It took a step closer, and I realized that its eyes weren't empty holes at all. They were filled with a glistening, predatory hunger that felt far too aware. I was frozen, my mind screaming at me to run, but my legs wouldn't move. The thing tilted its head the way a dog might when it's curious, and then it opened its mouth. That's when I heard it. The same whistle, now deafening and unbearably close, like it was mocking me. I turned and ran, not caring which direction I went. just needing to put distance between myself and whatever that was. The forest seemed to close in around me, branches clawing at my arms and legs as I stumbled through the underbrush. Every so often, I'd hear the whistle again, always just behind me, keeping pace. No matter how fast I ran, it was always there, just out of sight. I don't know how long I ran. Time lost all meaning as I plunged deeper into the woods, far from any recognizable path. Just when I thought I couldn't go any further, I burst into a clearing. There, in the middle, stood a small cabin. Relief washed over me as I saw light seeping from the windows, like a beacon in the dark. I stumbled to the door, banging on it with everything I had left in me. "Please, let me in," I gasped, half sobbing with fear. The door swung open, and a park ranger stood there, his face etched with a mix of concern and something else, something that almost looked like pity. He pulled me inside, shutting the door firmly behind me. I tried to explain what I'd seen, but the words came out in a frantic jumble. He just nodded, his face growing paler as he listened. When I finally stopped, he took a deep breath and said, "You weren't supposed to be out here alone. There are things in these woods that you can't understand. Things that don't take kindly to strangers." I shivered, feeling the warmth of the cabin start to seep into my bones. What was that?" I asked, almost afraid to hear the answer. He hesitated, then looked me straight in the eye. "Some call them skinwalkers. Others have different names for them, but they've been here far longer than we have, and they like to play with those who wander too far from safety." I opened my mouth to respond, but a sound cut me off, a high-pitched whistle echoing from just outside the cabin walls. My heart dropped, and I turned to the ranger, who was now staring at the door with a look of horror. "They're not supposed to follow you here," he whispered almost to himself. His eyes locked onto mine, and in that moment I knew that whatever this place was, it wasn't safe, not anymore. The ranger reached for something behind the door, a rifle or so I thought, but instead he pulled out a strange, ancient-looking mask. He slipped it over his head, and his entire posture changed, his limbs growing longer, his face twisting into that same hollow-eyed expression I'd seen before. And then it hit me. The man I'd followed wasn't a ranger at all. I stumbled back, my mind reeling as he took a step toward me, the whistle now filling the cabin like a shrieking wind. I turned and bolted through the door, plunging back into the endless, merciless dark, with the sound of that haunting whistle echoing in my ears. I don't remember much after that, just fragments of trees, shadows, and that endless, suffocating fear. When I finally stumbled out of the woods, exhausted and battered, I found myself back at the trailhead. The real ranger was there, his face pale as he saw me. I tried to explain, but he just shook his head. "You're lucky to be alive," he said quietly. "Most don't come back after seeing them." And as I drove away, I looked back one last time. At the edge of the forest, I thought I saw a figure watching, hollow eyes gleaming. And then, just as I turned away, I heard it, the faintest whistle, drifting through the trees. I still don't know what was real and what wasn't, but I do know one thing. I'll never go back into those woods again. I shouldn't have agreed to come here. I knew something was off the moment I set foot in these woods, but when my friends suggested a weekend camping trip to the Black Rock Wilderness, I didn't want to be the one to ruin the fun. Now, sitting alone in my tent, the fire dwindling outside, I can't shake the feeling that we're not alone out here. There are no other campers for miles. This part of the park is notorious for being remote, hard to reach. That's why we chose it. No crowds, no noise, just us, nature, and endless forest, and whatever else lurks in it. The first day was fine. We set up camp, had a few beers, and shared stories around the fire. But as the night wore on, the woods grew eerily quiet. No crickets, no owls, just the crackle of the fire and the occasional snap of a twig. We laughed it off, saying it was probably just deer or some other harmless animal moving in the brush. But deep down I could feel it, the wrongness, and we first noticed it around midnight. Paul, who had wandered off to relieve himself, came back pale, his face drawn tight. He didn't say much, just muttered something about seeing a coyote too close to camp. But when I pressed him, he shook his head, refusing to explain further. Then came the voices. It started as we were preparing to turn in for the night, distant, echoing through the trees, but unmistakably human. A man's voice calling out for help. We froze, listening. "Did you hear that?" Sarah whispered, clutching her sleeping bag tighter. "Probably someone lost," Paul said, though I could hear the uncertainty in his voice. Could be another group of campers. But we hadn't seen anyone else on the trail all day. The voice came again, this time closer. "Help." It was faint, barely audible over the crackling of the fire. But the desperation in it was real. It sent chills down my spine. "I'll go check it out," Matt said, grabbing his flashlight. He was always the brave one, the first to volunteer for anything risky. The rest of us exchanged nervous glances, but no one protested. We didn't want to seem paranoid. Matt disappeared into the dark trees, his flashlight beam cutting through the thick shadows. The forest swallowed him up, and soon the sound of his footsteps faded into nothing. Minutes passed, then an hour. No sign of Matt. No more voices. "Shouldn't he be back by now?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling. We tried calling out for him, but there was no response, just silence, thick and oppressive, pressing in on us from all sides. Paul stood up, pacing near the fire, clearly on edge. "Maybe he got lost. I'll go look for him." "No," I said quickly. "We shouldn't split up again. Let's wait a little longer." Paul reluctantly agreed, but I could see the unease growing in his eyes. We all felt it. Something was wrong out there. Another hour passed and still nothing. The fire was burning low, casting long, flickering shadows across the camp. Then suddenly, from the darkness, we heard it. "Hey, guys." It was Matt's voice coming from the woods. I shot to my feet. "Matt, where are you?" The voice was closer now, just beyond the edge of the firelight. "I'm over here." I grabbed the flashlight and shone it into the trees. But there was nothing, just the still, dark forest. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. "Matt, come into the light," I called, my voice shaking slightly. "We can't see you." Silence. Then, after a long pause, the voice came again. "Help me." It was Matt's voice, but wrong. The tone was off, flat and emotionless, like someone trying to mimic him but not quite getting it right. My stomach churned. Paul stepped forward, but I grabbed his arm. "Don't," I whispered. "Something's not right." Paul shook me off, his face twisted with frustration. "It's Matt. He's probably hurt. We have to help him." He turned and marched toward the sound, his flashlight sweeping through the trees. I followed him, heart pounding, every instinct screaming at me to turn back. Sarah stayed by the fire, eyes wide with fear. "Matt," Paul called out as we stepped into the woods, "where are you, man?" There was no response. Just when I thought maybe Paul had been right, maybe Matt was injured and disoriented, we heard the voice again, this time from behind us. "I'm over here." We spun around, shining the flashlight in the direction we'd just come from. But there was nothing there. My skin crawled. "We need to go back," I said, grabbing Paul's arm again. "Now." Paul hesitated, the confusion clear in his eyes. But before he could say anything, a figure emerged from the shadows, just at the edge of the light. It was Matt, but not. His movements were jerky, wrong, like a puppet on strings. His face was pale, almost waxen, and his eyes, God, his eyes, were black pits, reflecting nothing of the light around us. He stood there, swaying slightly, his mouth hanging open as though he was trying to speak but couldn't find the words. Then that voice came again, but it didn't come from his mouth. It came from somewhere deep in the woods, echoing all around us. "Help me." Paul took a step back, his face draining of color. "Matt?" The figure that looked like Matt tilted its head, as if considering the question, but didn't respond. Instead, it slowly raised one arm and pointed deeper into the forest. "Come with me." I backed away, pulling Paul with me. My heart was racing, my mind screaming that this wasn't real, this couldn't be real. But there it was, standing in front of us. Something that looked like our friend, but wasn't him. Couldn't be him. "Run," I whispered, barely able to get the word out. We bolted, crashing through the underbrush back toward the camp. Behind us, I heard that voice again, distant, but still too close. "Come with me." We burst back into the campsite, gasping for breath. But when we arrived, the fire had gone out. Sarah was gone. "Sarah," Paul yelled, spinning in circles, searching the dark. Then from the trees her voice came, faint, soft. "I'm over here." I grabbed Paul's arm, forcing him to stay put. "No," I said firmly. "That's not her. It's not her." Paul looked at me, terror filling his eyes. He knew I was right. He could feel it too. We didn't sleep that night. We just sat there, huddled in the cold darkness, waiting for the sun to rise. The voices kept coming, circling the camp, first Matt's, then Sarah's. Sometimes closer, sometimes further away, always calling, always asking for us to follow. "Help me. Come with me." By morning, we were both too exhausted to speak. When the first light of dawn finally broke through the trees, we packed up camp in silence, our eyes hollow, our minds reeling. We didn't speak of what we saw, of what we heard. We just walked, leaving the cursed place behind. We never found Sarah or Matt. When we finally made it back to the ranger station, I told the ranger everything. I expected him to be shocked, maybe even call for a search party. But he just looked at me, his face expressionless, and said, "You're lucky you made it out." That's when I realized he knew. He'd always known. We weren't the first. We wouldn't be the last. And whatever's out there in those deep woods, it's still waiting. The first few hours of the camping trip were like any other. We hiked deep into the forest, far away from the crowded campsites and well-trodden trails, determined to find somewhere secluded. It was just me, my best friend Eric, and his girlfriend Megan. The three of us had planned this trip for weeks, a quick weekend getaway to escape our busy lives. We found the perfect spot, an open clearing surrounded by thick trees with a small, bubbling creek nearby. The sound of the water was calming, and the air smelled like pine and earth. The first night we built a fire, roasted marshmallows, and shared stories under a blanket of stars. Everything felt right, peaceful, but that feeling didn't last. It started in the middle of the second night. I woke up in my tent to the sound of something moving outside. At first, I thought it was just the wind, maybe some branches scraping against each other. But the longer I lay there listening, the more I realized it wasn't the wind at all. It was footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps. They crunched softly over the dried leaves, circled the camp, and then stopped. I held my breath, straining to hear anything, but there was only silence. After a few moments, I told myself it had to be an animal, maybe a deer or some other curious creature. I forced myself to relax, but sleep didn't come easily. Something felt off, like the air had shifted. Heavy, oppressive. The next morning over breakfast, I asked if anyone else had heard anything. Eric shook his head, focused on cooking eggs over the fire. Megan, though, frowned, her eyes darting toward the tree line. "I thought I heard something too," she said quietly, "like someone walking around the tents." Eric laughed. "Probably just a raccoon or something. These woods are full of animals." But the look on Megan's face told me she wasn't convinced, and honestly, neither was I. That afternoon, we decided to explore deeper into the forest, following the creek upstream. It was beautiful, serene, the kind of place you see on postcards. But as we hiked, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Every time I turned around, expecting to see someone or something behind us, there was nothing, just trees and shadows. About an hour into the hike, we stumbled across something strange. An old, dilapidated cabin, half hidden behind a tangle of overgrown bushes. It looked ancient, like it hadn't been touched in decades. The wood was rotting, the roof caved in on one side. There was no sign of a path or road leading to it, and it definitely wasn't on the map we brought. "Whoa," Eric said, stepping closer. "How do you think this got here?" "Maybe it's an old ranger cabin," Megan suggested, though her voice wavered with uncertainty. "Or a hunting lodge." We circled the structure, curiosity getting the better of us. I peeked through one of the broken windows, half expecting to see nothing but cobwebs and decay. But inside, there were strange carvings on the walls, symbols I didn't recognize, etched deep into the wood, like someone had deliberately carved them there. "Let's go in," Eric said, already moving toward the door. "Are you serious?" Megan shot back, her tone sharp. "That place looks like it's ready to collapse." Eric waved her off. "Come on, it's just a quick look. We'll be fine." Reluctantly, Megan and I followed him inside. The air in the cabin was thick, musty, with a faint, sour smell that made my stomach turn. The carvings on the walls were even stranger up close. Spirals, jagged lines, symbols that felt wrong, somehow. "This is creepy," Megan muttered, rubbing her arms as if the temperature had dropped. Eric, unfazed, wandered further inside, but I stayed by the door, unease settling deep in my gut. Something about the place felt wrong, like it was hiding a secret, something we weren't supposed to see. That's when we found the trapdoor. It was half buried beneath a pile of debris, but Eric spotted the edge and cleared the rest of it off. The wooden door was old, splintered, with a rusted metal handle. "No way," I said, backing up. "We are not going down there." Eric, of course, was already pulling the trapdoor open, revealing a set of stairs descending into darkness. The smell that wafted up was worse than the mustiness in the cabin. It was foul, like something had died down there. "Eric, don't," Megan whispered, her voice trembling. "Let's just go back to camp." Eric paused, looking down into the dark void, and for a moment I thought he was going to listen to her. But then he smirked. "What's the worst that could happen?" He took a step down, then another. "Eric," I called, but my voice sounded small, almost swallowed by the cabin itself. He disappeared into the darkness, leaving Megan and me standing there, our hearts pounding. Seconds stretched into minutes, and then nothing. No sound. No movement. "Eric," Megan called, her voice shaking. "This isn't funny." I grabbed my flashlight and shined it down the stairs. The beam barely penetrated the thick darkness below. "Megan, wait here, I'll go get him." Before she could protest, I started down the stairs, every fiber of my being screaming at me to turn back. The steps creaked under my weight, and the foul smell grew stronger with every breath. As I reached the bottom, my flashlight flickered and went out. Panic surged through me as I fumbled to turn it back on. The darkness was suffocating, pressing in from all sides. But then, as the light blinked back to life, I saw it. Eric was standing in the middle of a small dirt floor room, staring at the far wall. His back was to me, and for a moment, relief washed over me. I stepped forward, calling his name, but he didn't respond. "Eric?" He didn't move. My flashlight beam followed his gaze, and that's when I saw what he was looking at. Carved into the dirt wall was a door. Not a real door, but an outline crudely scratched into the earth, and around it those same strange symbols from the cabin walls. "Eric, let's get out of here," I said, my voice cracking. But Eric didn't answer. He just kept staring, frozen, like he was in a trance. And then, in a voice that wasn't his, he whispered, "It's open." Suddenly the trapdoor above slammed shut, plunging us into darkness. I yelled for Megan, but the only sound was Eric's heavy breathing next to me. He turned slowly, and when the light hit his face, my stomach dropped. His eyes were blank, wide, and empty. "They're coming," he whispered. I bolted for the stairs, practically dragging Eric behind me. When we reached the top, I slammed into the trapdoor, pushing it open with all my strength. Megan was on the other side, screaming, her face pale as death. We didn't stop running until we reached the clearing where our tents were. Eric barely spoke for the rest of the night, his face slack and pale. We packed up and left at first light. On the drive home, no one said a word. But I couldn't shake the feeling that we hadn't escaped that place. Not really. Because ever since that night, I've been dreaming of that cabin. And in every dream, that carved door is waiting. And each time it's opened just a little bit wider. Camping had always been my escape. The world felt small and manageable in the quiet of the woods under the stars, with just a fire and the sounds of nature. I never imagined something so serene could become so wrong. This time I went alone. I needed the space, the solitude. Work had been stressful, life even more so. My friends had warned me not to go by myself, said it wasn't safe, but I brushed them off. I'd done this plenty of times before. I found a perfect spot, far off the main trail, near a small stream, surrounded by towering trees that blotted out most of the sky. The forest felt ancient, untouched, and utterly still. The kind of place where you could forget the rest of the world existed. I set up camp, built a fire, and settled in as the sun dipped low, casting long shadows through the trees. As darkness crept in, the woods became eerily silent. No animals rustling through the leaves, no distant calls of birds, just the crackling of the fire and the occasional breeze whispering through the branches. It felt wrong, but I chalked it up to my imagination. Being alone in the wilderness could mess with your head. I decided to turn in early, the exhaustion of the week catching up with me. I zipped myself into my sleeping bag, the warmth of the fire outside barely reaching the tent. I drifted off quickly, the quiet of the forest lulling me to sleep. I don't know what time it was when I woke up, but something had pulled me out of a deep sleep. I lay there, disoriented, listening to the silence outside. And then I heard it. A soft, rhythmic tapping. Tap, tap, tap. It was coming from outside the tent, somewhere in the trees. At first I thought it was a branch knocking against something, but the sound was too deliberate, too steady. My heart began to race, but I told myself it was probably just some animal, maybe a woodpecker, though the tapping didn't sound like that either. I lay there for what felt like hours, listening. The tapping would stop for a few minutes, then start again, always the same pace, always from the same direction. Eventually, exhaustion won over my fear, and I drifted back to sleep. When I woke the next morning, I felt uneasy. The fire had long since died, and the forest was as still and quiet as it had been the night before. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me, that something had been close during the night. I walked to the edge of the clearing, trying to see if there was anything unusual in the trees, but there was nothing. No sign of animals, no footprints, just undisturbed dirt and leaves. I convinced myself I was being paranoid. It's easy to get spooked when you're out here alone. Still, I couldn't shake the tension in my chest, so I decided to take a hike to clear my head, get some distance from camp. The forest felt suffocating as I walked, the trees looming overhead like silent sentinels, their branches thick and intertwined, blocking out the sun. The trail I followed was barely visible, more of a suggestion than a path winding deeper into the woods. The further I went, the stronger that feeling grew. The sense that I wasn't alone, that something was watching me. Then up ahead I saw it. At first I thought it was a trick of the light or maybe my mind playing games with me. But as I got closer I realized what I was looking at. A tree, its bark stripped away in long, jagged lines, like something had clawed at it. Deep gouges ran down the trunk, fresh enough that the wood beneath was still pale and raw. I stopped dead in my tracks, my stomach twisting. What kind of animal could do that? The claw marks were too large, too deep. It looked more like the work of a person than any creature I'd ever encountered in these woods. As I stood there, staring at the tree, the tapping sound returned. Soft, steady. Tap, tap, tap. This time it was closer. I spun around, my heart hammering in my chest, but there was nothing there. just the thick, oppressive trees closing in on all sides. The tapping stopped, leaving me in the deafening silence of the forest. I didn't know what to do. Part of me wanted to run, to get the hell out of there, but another part of me, the part that's always been too curious for its own good, needed to know what was making that sound. I followed the noise. It led me deeper into the woods, the tapping growing louder, more insistent. My heart raced, my palms sweaty as I gripped the knife I'd brought along, though I wasn't sure what good it would do. The trees seemed to press in closer the further I went, their branches twisting and tangling overhead, blocking out most of the light. And then I saw it. A cabin. Small, run down, almost hidden by the overgrowth of the forest. It looked like it had been abandoned for years, its wooden walls rotting, the roof sagging in places. But the tapping was coming from inside. I should have turned back. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to leave, to run. But I didn't. Instead, I approached the cabin, my footsteps barely making a sound in the thick layer of leaves and dirt. The front door was ajar, creaking softly as it moved with the breeze. I hesitated, staring at the dark space beyond. The tapping had stopped again, leaving the woods eerily quiet. I stepped inside. The air inside the cabin was stale, thick with the smell of rot and damp wood. The floor creaked under my weight as I moved further in, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. The cabin was empty. No furniture, no signs of life, just dirt and decay. And then from behind me the tapping started again. I whipped around, my flashlight scanning the room, but there was nothing. Just the cabin, empty and silent. Suddenly the door slammed shut, plunging me into darkness. I ran to the door, fumbling with the handle, but it wouldn't budge. Panic surged through me as the tapping grew louder, faster. It was right behind me now, almost rhythmic, like a heartbeat. My breath came in short gasps as I turned, pressing my back to the door, my flashlight shaking in my hand. And that's when I saw it. In the corner of the room, crouched low to the ground, was a figure. Its limbs were long, too long, twisted and wrong. Its skin was pale and slick, like it had been stretched too tight over its bones. It stared at me with hollow, empty eyes, its mouth hanging open in a grotesque grin. The tapping had stopped. It didn't need to make a sound anymore. It was there, right in front of me. I didn't wait. I threw myself at the door, pounding on it, screaming until finally it gave way. I stumbled out into the forest, my legs weak, my mind reeling. I ran, blindly, crashing through the underbrush, not caring where I was going as long as it was away from that thing. I don't know how long I ran, hours maybe. By the time I stopped, I was lost, completely disoriented, my camp nowhere in sight. But I didn't care. I just kept moving, putting as much distance between me and that cabin as possible. I never went back for my tent, my gear. I never went back for anything. When I finally made it back to civilization, I didn't tell anyone what had happened. Who would believe me? But sometimes late at night when the world is quiet, I can still hear it. That soft, steady tapping,